Good afternoon. Welcome to Peoria City Council's special study session for December 3. The clerk, please call the roll.
Mayor Barrett.
Here.
Vice Mayor Rivero.
Here.
Councilmember Ames.
Here.
Councilmember Patena.
Here.
Councilmember Edwards.
Here.
Councilmember Carlott. Here. Councilmember Leone.
Here.
Council Liaison Jelinek.
Here.
Council Liaison Pryor.
Here.
Okay, I did not get the revised agenda here. Would you please rise, join us in a moment of silence and the Pledge of Allegiance led by Councilmember Leone. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We're about to have a study session on impact fees and update. This is the first bite at the apple. We will not act on, we have to act on this by August of 14, right? Okay. 15. Oh, 14, yeah. So we're not going to be making any final decisions this evening. Study session is an opportunity for the council and the staff to have a conversation about the topic. And then we, like I said, we can't vote on anything tonight. So this is an informational session.
Good. Thank you, Mayor Barrett and council members. Thank you for coming together this evening for a special study session. This, of course, is the second time we have talked about the changes in the state impact fee laws, and the first discussion was rather short, probably just long enough to completely confuse the council. I say that with a little bit of humor. Because it's a complicated subject, and we gave you a brief introduction to it in that previous session. But tonight what we want to do is have an opportunity to really drill down into the changes, what they mean for Peoria, both in terms of our development regime, but also, and importantly, what they mean to us in terms of our financial regime, because the changes in the law that have occurred that we'll be talking about, when you take those changes up to really the 30,000 foot level, what's real apparent is that they make some fundamental alterations to the principle of growth paying for growth. One of the fundamentals that we have followed in Arizona and have aspired to follow is the notion that growth in fair measure pays for growth. And that was the underpinning of the previous laws with respect to impact fees. And to some extent they still underpin the law, but the changes eroded that principle in some fairly significant ways. And so what we now have is greater pressure on our operating budget in the years forward to pay for some of those critical facilities that will be needed to service the new growth that used to be paid for by impact fee dollars. So it pressurizes our future discussions with respect to our operating and capital budgets, particularly our capital budget. And so tonight's conversation is also a good precursor to this Friday's council budget workshop. Because what we see is a combination of law changes, and Steve Kemp will speak to some of this in his portion of the presentation tonight, a combination of things that pressurize our budget going forward. We have less revenue opportunities in the future to pay for some of these critical capital and operating services that are important to our current and future residents. So I wanted to mention that as a bit of a precursor before I turn it over to Brent. And what you'll have tonight is a mix of staff leaders making presentations to you. So Brent, Katie, and Steve will do the lion's share of that, but we also have Bill Mattingly and Andy Granger prepared if you have questions with respect to capital items in the utilities and transportation arena as well. So I'll stop my little introduction here and turn it over to Brent, and he'll give you a flavor for how we'll be proceeding tonight.
Thanks, Carl. So tonight we're going to give you kind of an update on the work we've been doing as staff on the new impact fee laws and legislation, and then talk about, after tonight, what are the remaining steps. There are quite a few things that are left, and you're going to be involved in those in terms of public hearings and then adopting certain items and ultimately the fees themselves. But as important as having that conversation with you about kind of what we've done and where we are and where we're headed, it's really an opportunity, I think, it's a great opportunity for you to ask whatever questions you have about impact fees and to have a discussion among yourselves or with us about impact fees and how they're impacting Peoria and where we see ourselves headed. We're going to start out with an overview. I'm going to give kind of an brief overview of the tools that we have to pay for the things associated with growth in the city of Peoria, and usually that's capital projects. It can also, once you build those capital projects, obviously you have to operate them, so those can turn into staffing costs and other operating costs as well. And then on the agenda, item 3, Steve Kemp's going to spend quite a few minutes here talking about the new impact fee legislation that was adopted, and that greatly changed kind of the playing field, not only for us but for all other cities and towns in Arizona as to how impact fees work, what can be included in them, how they're calculated, the adoption process, etc. Then Katie's going to spend some time kind of giving, first of all, I think explaining some of the terminology, because the terminology and the legislation that Katie and her staff have been using kind of as a matter of course over the last year or so doesn't mean a lot to people like me, or probably to you who don't deal with this on a full-time basis. So when we talk about IIP, it's an infrastructure improvement plan. Okay, but what is that? And is it the same thing as the city's capital plan? And if not, why not? And those types of things. What's the other term? It's not growth, but the land use assumptions. Okay. Well, we think about land use assumptions in terms of general plan and zoning and planning cases that come before you. But in this case, it's speaking, and Katie will get into this more. How many single-family homes are going to get built? Where are they going to be built? What commercial development is going to be built over the next 10 years or so? And even more importantly than that, what types of capital infrastructure does that new growth require? And Steve can explain that new capital infrastructure has to be related to that new construction, those new single-family homes, and the services that those services in terms of like streets and water and wastewater, capital infrastructure, what do they need in order to develop? And that can be quite different depending upon where you are in the city. So, you look out where Vistancia is, Lake Pleasant Heights, State Route 74, there's not a lot out there today. But you're going to see in our development projections that we're planning the next year for some development to occur out in that area of the city. Likewise, there's going to be construction in certain areas like Alora Vita that has some development around it. West Wing and other development already exists, so some of that infrastructure's already in place. In other parts of the city, outside City Hall, there may be new single-family construction, but there isn't. Those new single-family construction doesn't require significant new regional infrastructure. That infrastructure exists, and all of those things, as Katie will explain, get taken into account as we go through ultimately calculating what our impact fees should be moving forward. So Katie will talk about that. She'll talk about get into these growth assumptions, what those capital projects are by type of project and area of the city. And then we'll go over what happens next after tonight? What are the remaining steps? So, at a high level, depending upon where this growth occurs, it can require those significant capital investments. So again, water treatment facilities, major water delivery systems, wastewater treatment facilities, transportation infrastructure, streets where the large regional structures don't exist or need to be expanded, again, to accommodate that growth. And as Carl mentioned, kind of to start off, item 2, we're going to talk a little bit about this concept, and we've talked about it for years, of growth paying for growth. And that's kind of been a mantra in Arizona. Growth hasn't always paid for 100% of the costs of growth. And I think, as Carl mentioned, that landscape is even changing further as we look ahead, due to the impact fee legislation in particular, but for other reasons as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There are other ways to help pay for growth as well. Again, I'm going to talk about what some of those options are and what some of those tools are. But again, the desired outcome this evening is really that at the end of this time with you, and we have the full time set aside this evening, that you have your questions answered, we've had the conversations that you'd like to have, and that we all walk away with a firm understanding, a better understanding of what this new impact fee legislation means in Peoria.
And let me add, while Brent's pausing there, we've built a few spots into our presentation tonight for questions and discussion, but of course feel free to ask questions anytime throughout. We want to make sure that we're answering your questions whenever you have them.
So when we talk about what are the tools that are available, and these aren't all the same for each city. Different cities have differences in their growth characteristics. There's differences in amount of land available and the capacity of their existing infrastructure systems or the need to build new infrastructure systems. It depends upon whether the growth is occurring right next to where there's already a lot of development or what we've kind of called leapfrog development. So maybe an example of that is, Quintero's kind of way out there. There wasn't much around, there still isn't very much around it. And it's important to keep in mind that, Peoria is a little bit different than some other cities in respects in terms of developers want to be here. We're a desirable place for developers to be operating, for people to move. That's not always the case. So an example might be outlying areas down in Florence. They may have to do things to incent developers to come down there. Or I spent Thanksgiving way out in Queen Creek, and that's a long way, and there isn't a lot out there, really. I mean, the road systems aren't very good, and they may need to do things to incent developers to come out as well. And how they fund the capital needed for that next kind of growth spurt, they may have different tools and different methods than Peoria may use, or to use to one extent or another. And these decisions are going to impact other decisions that you make, and we can start, as Carl mentioned, we can talk about that Friday at the workshop a little bit. So decisions we make here in terms of are going to impact things like potentially utility rates, and I'll get into that a little bit more, or taxes on a resident that's in a community facilities district, or if we use general obligation bonds to pay for some growth-related infrastructure, that capacity may not be available for some other projects that you're interested in. So there's sometimes trade-offs as we go through these. Another concept to kind of keep in mind is that of using these tools to build regional infrastructure versus kind of development-specific infrastructure. Let me give you an example of that. in community facilities districts, that's a tool, and the city of Peoria obviously has used that up in Vistancia. And we primarily use that to construct regional water and wastewater infrastructure systems. That's not always the case. There are examples, for example, I was reading some documents a few weeks ago related to a community facilities district down by Florence. And in that community facilities district, they took almost the exact opposite approach. And their community facilities district was really to help the developer pay for the street, the curb, the gutter, the water line, and the wastewater line right down the street in front of the house, okay? And each of those houses was assessed, had an assessment placed on it to pay for all or a portion of that cost. But again, an example of, and some of that's, quite honestly, a policy decision as we move forward looking at community facilities districts. Does the city council want to use that tool for only large regional infrastructure? Do you want to use it for local infrastructure? Are there certain quality of development standards or economic development standards that are tied to your decision as to whether or not to use that tool?
I don't want to interrupt you here, Brent, but I do want to know if this new legislation is going to impact any of these other methods of financing.
The impact fee legislation doesn't directly impact these other methods of financing, but to the extent the new legislation limits the ability to charge fees to recover some of the infrastructure we constructed in the past using impact fees, then we're going to have to look at one of these other tools if we want to build that infrastructure. So certain types of infrastructure that impact fees could have paid for in the past, and Steve will get into this in a minute, those are simply no longer allowed. For example, you can't use impact fees to build a city hall building.
Right, but if you did a CFD, we could use a CFD in any manner that we chose, because it's not, a CFD is outside of the realm of any of the legislative text, right?
Yeah, you can use,
Please say yes.
the CFD legislation has not changed. There are certain types of infrastructure improvements, a wide variety of infrastructure improvements that a community facilities district can finance. And this hasn't changed either. You can't pay for something with a community facilities district and then also charge an impact fee for it. You'd be charging twice, but that's no different than it has been.
Okay.
So I don't think that there's a direct correlation between the impact fee legislation and community facilities districts.
So the assessments placed on individual homes is outside of this legislation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
As long as it doesn't involve paying for something that you charge an impact fee for.
Thanks.
Kind of going around the circle maybe a little bit. General obligation bonds, I won't spend a lot of time on this because really we want to talk about impact fees tonight. But general obligation bonds are another tool we commonly use to pay for large infrastructure projects. Steve's going to talk a little bit about a different piece of legislation that was passed that will impact our ability to use general obligation bonds. And really it's more of a capacity issue. It somewhat limits our future capacity potentially to use general obligation bonds to the same extent we might otherwise. So we'll get into that. Improvement districts have been a tool that have been around for a long time. The city has used those. Certain improvements at Park West, 83rd Avenue, around the sports complex have been in the past financed through improvement districts. Developer exactions, usually part of the zoning and planning process where the developer would agree or be required to pay for certain infrastructure improvements. Developer contributions, obviously towards, just cash contributions towards projects. Repayment agreements, a tool where if one party builds something that benefits another, a repayment agreement can be placed on it, and a future developer within a certain period of time, generally 10 years, would have to pay for its share of that improvement. So that tool isn't widely used and is somewhat limited in cases like state land development, but it is a tool that's available. Utility revenue bonds, supported by water and wastewater rates, often used to build capital infrastructure, whether that's the Greenway water treatment plant, Pyramid Peak expansions, the Beardsley plant, the Jomax plant. And the reason for that really is that some of that type of infrastructure has to be in place day one before a home can be built and anybody can move in, right? So if we're collecting impact fees in the future as residents move in, we didn't have that cash flow up front necessary to build expensive treatment facilities or distribution facilities. So oftentimes, quite honestly, we issue utility revenue bonds that finance infrastructure improvements that end up supporting future growth in the city. And there's some things we can do with impact fees to help pay for that later on, but that is a tool that we use commonly for financing growth. See if there's anything else I want to say. Other sources that probably aren't up there, we have the transportation sales tax. So either on a pay-as-you-go cash basis or by issuing debt, which we did up front to pay for Happy Valley Road and 83rd Avenue improvements. So that's an option. Oftentimes we use one-time operating funds, so one-time balance to contribute towards capital projects. And we have IGA funding with either the federal government, maybe it's an agreement with flood control district, could be an agreement with another city to finance certain growth or other capital projects. Any questions before I go on? So the note's kind of up in the corner. It is kind of a new environment today. There have been obviously those legislative changes that Steve's going to talk about. The economy and the market realities in terms of development have changed from where they were a few years ago. And that's probably a permanent change. Developer financing and growth assumptions and those types of things are different today than they were in the past. And we do have the large undeveloped areas where there simply isn't much today, but the developers are very interested in building over the next several years. And again, I think I briefly mentioned that even once we build these infrastructure projects, oftentimes there are operating costs associated with those. So it might be, building a park, but then the cost to water the park, mow the park, pay the electricity, et cetera. So kind of, at a 30,000 foot level, what are these impact fees? And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because we'll cover it in a couple minutes, but they're simply one-time payments that are collected when the building permit's issued that's subject to pretty detailed legal and statutory requirements that support those capital needs associated with new growth. In the process, again, Katie's going to get into more detail, but we have to determine, where is that growth going to occur? What's the cost of the capital infrastructure directly related to that growth? Allocating those costs fairly between single family and multifamily and commercial development. And again, we're going to get into a lot more detail. So how does that sound for where we're headed tonight? Is that going to probably...
Be all right?
So I think we'll get started first with Steve updating you on kind of the new impact fee legislation, and then at the end of that, just to make it real clear, there's a second piece of legislation not related to impact fees that's related to general obligation bonds that he's also going to touch briefly on.
Thank you, Brent. In order to understand where we really are today with impact fees, it's really necessary to take a step back and look at the past. if you go back to 2009, the entire impact fee statute was half a page. And it was a very easy statute from a lawyer's perspective to work with because it basically stated the city council could define necessary public services. The city council could devise an infrastructure improvements plan, and it could be any number of years. And the level of service standards could be established by the city, and the city could bring up existing areas at some time in the future, but there was never any real requirement on when that might be. So from a lawyer's perspective, it was just a very easy statute. Today, our impact fee statute is 11 pages. It is a statute that has drawn from statutes in New Mexico, Texas, and all over the country, not terribly related together, and it now is a very, very detailed statute. And that's important because as we move into the discussion that Katie is going to have with you, how the statute has changed directly influences that discussion. So first, let's talk about necessary public services. In the past, necessary public services, as I said, was defined by the city. And some cities had impact fees for arts. The court building across the plaza was built in large part with impact fees. We had impact fees for libraries and open space and trails. The legislation now defines impact fees as being very specific items: water, wastewater, stormwater and drainage, libraries up to 10,000 square feet, street facilities, fire and police facilities, but no vehicles, no airplanes, no helicopters, no administrative facilities, no training facilities, and neighborhood parks and recreational facilities, but no vehicles, equipment, aquariums, aquatic centers, auditoriums, arenas, and cultural facilities. So we now have those definitions to work with. Secondly, the city has to develop land use assumptions. And these land use assumptions have to be connected to your general plan, and they must really outline what does the city expect the growth to be within its city boundaries, and how is that growth going to create a demand for necessary public facilities. Now, Katie's going to talk about what we commonly call the IIP, which is the Infrastructure Improvements Plan. And again, where this wasn't defined in the statute, now it has a whole series of very specific definitions. The most important ones for the council to understand is this plan is going to have to identify the current levels of necessary public services in the city, those things that we just talked about, and our current service levels for those facilities. The current, in essence, if we have for parks, 1 foot per 1 person, we have to identify that. We have to equate our current service levels to our service units. And a unit cost would be, for example, a residence. We have to identify that connection. And then we have to, as part of this whole plan, identify new revenues that development is going to generate. And those have to be built in to the plan because you have to provide an offset for those. And then finally, we have to identify service areas. Now, in the past, service areas could be a very broad item. Now, service areas have to directly relate to the burden that new development is going to cause. So, for example, if you have an area of the city where new development does not require any parks, then that service area you would not be able to charge an impact fee for because it's not the new development is not creating the burden in the service area. And in the past, we could define service areas very, very broadly. The new legislation doesn't allow us to do that.
Question? Just a second. Ed?
Mr. Kemp, who defines whether there's a need or not?
Well, in terms of this, and depending on the type of necessary public services, A, we go to our land use assumptions. B, we go to our general plan and our specific plans for those items. C, part of our infrastructure improvement plan is going to actually identify those specific projects generated by growth. You may have a project in your capital improvements plan, but it's not one generated by growth. It may be just to simply provide better access or better, or more improved level of services. And that is going to come out of this whole impact fee process over the next few months, is which ones are growth related and would be subject to impact fees, and which ones are simply the result of a city choosing to provide a facility but not necessarily related to growth.
Okay, so council will determine which projects.
Ultimately, you will determine, you'll receive an infrastructure improvements plan, which will be for the council to decide how to approve. I mean, certainly your staff is going to provide the lion's share of the expertise, but it will ultimately be something that you have to approve.
Okay, but just for clarification, council's going to decide.
The council will be approving that plan.
Okay.
Maybe, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Maybe somebody can help me, but I think part of the answer to that is that's what we're working through with the stakeholders over these past couple months and continuing over the next couple months. So Katie's going to talk a little bit about who those stakeholders are. So it's obviously the Home Builders Association, the large developers in the city of Peoria, Multifamily Association, Valley Partnership in terms of commercial development, State Land Department, and those stakeholders have been invited to attend and have been attending either in person or over the phone when they can, a series of meetings. And those meetings were initially to talk to them about development assumptions. Steve, the technical language is land use assumptions. But what that really means is what's going to be built, where is it going to be built, and when's it going to be built. And those are estimates, and they're going to change. And I think, I'll just tangent side comment, it's important to keep in mind through this whole process that the legislation requires that the city revisit this periodically, every minimum of every 5 years, but you can do it more frequently. So if those growth assumptions change and the capital facilities needed to support that growth changes, we're going to be going through this process and coming back, working with the stakeholders and bringing it back to City Council periodically to amend the level of impact fees. So kind of a long answer, I think, to your question. We're in the process of talking to those stakeholders about not only the growth projections, but what capital facilities are going to be required that meet the legal language of the new statute to support that growth. And those would typically be the capital projects that we would include in our infrastructure improvement plan and in our impact fee calculation. Once you, and Katie's, sorry, I'm kind of jumping the gun, but you go, I mean, it's not easy, so we'll go through it kind of again, but develop your growth projections, develop the projects that are needed to support that growth or portions of projects that are needed to support that growth, figure out where those projects are and where the growth is, so that we're going to talk about the zones, and there are different zones depending upon where the growth is and where those capital projects are. And then that process, the outcome is a calculated impact fee. And those calculated impact fees are going to go through a public hearing process and council discussion and stakeholder input. And then the council is going to make a determination at what level do we want to adopt those impact fees. And those would be the maximum supportable fees that are allowed under the statute. So that's kind of the process, and the specific projects are just one piece of it that we're working through now with those stakeholders that are going to result in a study, a preliminary, the impact fee study is going to be published on the website, and then there's opportunity for people to review it, and then we're, again, a series of steps back in front of you. Is that kind of a little broader?
Yes.
But we'll get into more of that in a few minutes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, get another question? Ms. Scarlett?
Thanks. I have a question regarding the offsets. You mentioned new revenues are going to have to be offset, or are going to have to be an offset of the impact fees. So if you've got a mixed-use development, say, and it's got, residential community as well as commercial on it, and there's going to be revenues from the commercial side, does that offset the impact fees we're able to collect from the residential side?
Not necessarily. The issue will be in each of these, and this is part of the whole both infrastructure improvements plan and fee study that you do, is that you really look to see if the revenues generated by that particular type of new development, if they offset the burden it causes. So the fact that you may have some commercial development doesn't necessarily mean that the residential is going to get an offset. What the statute did in changing is before it was very, very limited the types of offsets. Now we have to go through a much more complex analysis in looking at these offsets. For example, some cities had construction sales tax that they used for capital projects. And those cities charged that in an impact fee. Well, now they have to offset that tax from the fee because, in essence, it's viewed as a double collection. So the answer is not necessarily the impact you do a mixed-use project and there's some increase in sales tax revenue from commercial isn't going to require, per se, an offset of the residential impact fee.
So you are saying then that sales tax revenue is going to count against the amount of
I'm
impact
simply
fees,
saying
which is growth?
that as part of our analysis, we now have to look at that, where before we really didn't. It's going to be a piece of the analysis that we look at.
I think maybe a simple way to look at that is that to the extent that we use those revenues to pay for the kinds of facilities that we've included or the facilities that we've included in the impact fee, we would have to offset that.
Okay, is it customary for us to say that we are going to get tax revenues from this commercial development and we're going to use that to pay for some of that growth?
Typically, a lot of our tax revenues that we generate through sales tax and through our primary and secondary primary property tax are not used to pay for capital facilities. We may at times do that, but we don't necessarily know what those are today, and we wouldn't program that for that kind of use. To the extent that we do use it for that, we would have to look at an offset in the future.
And don't we normally put those revenues in our general fund?
Yes, and they're typically used for general operations, not capital type needs.
Okay, and nothing will change in that regard, right?
Right.
Nothing changes in that
I'm
regard.
just
It's
trying to
only-
make sure that there's some limitations here on what this new legislation
That
does.
legislative change, I think, was adopted because there are certain cities that have differential sales tax rates, for example, for construction, that generates additional revenue above and beyond other types of normal
Excise
kind of
tax.
baseline,
Okay.
that the interested parties wanted to make sure that because their development was generating that construction sales tax increment, not the normal, but the increment,
The increment.
and that it was designed to pay for capital facilities, that they got recognition of that. Is that kind of a summary, Steve?
Yes, and I think, as Katie said and as Brent said, the key here is we generally don't tie these revenues to the capital program. If we started tying them to the capital program, and in particular, new development, that then this becomes more of an issue. We don't do that. It's just something to be aware of. The statute is much more stringent than it was.
Okay. I have one other question.
Can I,
if
can I,
might.
Ms. Carlett, can I respond a little bit to that? I think where the general budget might be impacted, though, from the example you gave, would be in those areas where, because of the new tighter definitions on what's a facility that impact fees can be applied to, we're likely to be building facilities that are outside of that definition. And that's where the pressure comes on our general fund budget.
Okay, so if we build a larger library, for instance, they want to make sure that we're not using some of these incremental funds to build that library.
That's right, or a regional park, or any of the things that customarily we have thought of and used revenue from impact fees for. This tightens that definition considerably, and that's where it pressurizes our future financial decisions. Those facilities will need to compete against all of the other funding needs we have in our budget.
Okay, and I do have another question with regards to the amendments. So you've got land use assumption, and you say that those can be amended within the 5-year period of time every year, or as often as we need them, right?
As often as you need to. It'd be
Okay.
Yes.
difficult to do it every year because of the timelines to enact and the process you have to go through to amend. So you probably wouldn't amend your impact fees, I wouldn't think, probably every year, but you certainly could do it in less than 5 years.
Okay, but I'm talking about land use assumptions. So say that we did not put a road in this assumption, but now there is going to be that road, so we need to include that in our land use assumptions. So in order for someone to come to us and say, this needs to be amended, is it going to be similar to the process that we have for doing a general plan amendment? And if so, right now we have a general plan that's got text, which is the policy. So there's a minor general plan amendment, there's a major general plan amendment, and those are dictated by size, among other things. So where will the policies lie for this kind of amendment? And you just threw me into another question saying that it's much more difficult. I thought that it was going to be much simpler than what we currently do for amendments for general plan.
I would generally say that the statute allows for us to make amendments to the plan as needed, and that could be in the form of making amendments to projects that we include in the IIP or the capital projects facilities, and there's a process to do that. It's not as laborious, so to speak, as this full update and requires all the timelines that are associated with this full update, but it does require us to go back and look, and ideally, by choosing a methodology that is more flexible to allow you to move those projects in or out as, say, growth occurs in a slightly different pattern than what we projected today.
Right.
We may want to remove a project and add in a project that's more in line with where that growth is occurring or what kinds of projects are needed to serve where growth is occurring in the city. So we have the ability to do that. It's not as laborious, like I said, as the full-blown impact fee update. And it does allow us an opportunity to do that. It does require, I believe, Steve, does it require a public hearing on that?
And it's going to require a public hearing. When you do that, essentially, it's going to involve two things. If you amend the infrastructure improvements plan, you have to go back and look at your your land use assumptions, or what we call growth projections. So you're going to be looking at those two things. As Katie said, it's not as laborious as the impact fee. It's just you will be looking at those two things. The amendments to the IIP involve having to go back and look at the land use assumptions. But that is something that the statute envisions that you're going to be doing that, and if that thing comes up that there's a road that we need to look at, then we go back and go through the process for the amending the land use assumptions in the infrastructure improvements plan. But that's not the same as what we are doing right now, which is this whole comprehensive fee study and comprehensive fee program.
Right, but it is something that will become customary, right? Like general plan amendments.
Yes, I
I'm
think
asking this because if we don't get it right the first time, how hard is it for somebody to come back and add a road or add some other infrastructure?
Some of that gets into more complicated discussions about the type of methodology that we're using or proposing to use in order to provide that higher level of flexibility in doing that. So as staff, we're trying to bring forward a methodology that we believe provides us the most flexibility to do that. In doing that, that means that, yes, a year from now, when we have better information about what's happening where, although I will tell you that we've gone through an extensive discussion with our developers. We're very aware of the projects, very aware of how their timing of growth and where they think it's going to happen and in what phasing they think it's going to happen. So we've been made very aware of that. We've tried to look at that. It's a 10-year plan, so a project that we thought might happen in the 8th year, if it happens in the 4th, that's not as much of a problem. But we absolutely look at these assumptions every year. We look at growth assumptions every year anyway, because we do planning, financial planning, impact fee planning, just, operational planning, all related to kind of these growth assumptions, and we look at those regularly. Those may change, but in the aggregate, when you're looking over a 10-year period, if we're a little off in the first couple of years and a little, but have a little more in the years following, that's not going to impact it as much because of the methodology that we're proposing. But we will absolutely be able to make adjustments to projects if we feel we need to do that. And yes, I would expect that 2 years from now, when we know more, we're going to want to come back and make an adjustment. 2 years after that, we may want to make an adjustment. It doesn't mean we have to adjust the fees. It just means we may have to make an adjustment to what's in the plan.
And are these adjustments made only through staff, or are they made as general plan amendments are made by outside entities?
My thought is that as we have development come into the city, and we may have areas that come in that we haven't even identified yet. They have not necessarily come to the plate yet, so to speak, and are planning to come through. And there may be infrastructure requirements associated with that beyond what we believe we've already caught. And if that's the case, then we would want to look at, if it's a new project, adding a new project, depending upon the methodology, it may trigger the need for us to update the fee. If it triggers the need for the update to the fee, it's a little slightly different process. But if it just is moving a project in and the fee doesn't change, then it's another process. So it can be, it just depends on what the change is, I guess is the answer to that. But we fully anticipate there will be changes to the IIP.
Where is the text going to be written that governs the policy? In general plan, you can go there and see what's a major amendment, what's a minor, what's the policy, what's the procedure. Where will this be?
I think that will primarily come as part of the fee ordinance. When we put the fee ordinance together, that will be part of the ordinance that we have council approve. We'll include some of that implementation language and amendment language in that.
It will be part of the fee ordinance. And as Katie alluded to, yes, I think this will become a regular process. And I think it would just be something that for the future, as long as the statute's in place the way it is, councils will have to address this. I think it will be very doable. It's just going to be something that we're going to have to be addressing, and the processes will be different if we're just talking about amending the infrastructure improvements plan or if we're talking about adjusting fees. But it will be something that I think will just become an ongoing process that it may not be annually, it may be every other year, but yes, you'll be addressing it periodically because that's the way the statute now works.
Okay, necessary public facilities, you talked about no vehicles allowed to be included in that. So if you talk about a fire or police station and you can't include
There will be
vehicles-
some exceptions because fire vehicles and police vehicles for the police side will be permitted, but vehicles for the administrative side, just like the administrative side in the past, we never really worried about a police station in terms of what's police and what's administrative. Now we will be in the future looking at that. Is there any piece of a police station that's administrative? Is there any piece of a fire facility? For example, an adjacent city has a fire training facility. You would not be able to pay for that facility with impact fees under the statute.
But you can pay for fire trucks.
And so it's going to be, but you'd be able to pay for a fire station and fire vehicles.
Okay.
So that's a great example. The training facility used to be allowed, used to be able to charge an impact fee for it, I believe. In fact, we invested in one, but as Carl mentioned to kick off the study session this evening, no longer allowed. So you have to go find the money to pay for that training facility somewhere else, and so it's competing against other council priorities as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ron?
Yeah, I think the short answer here is there's flexibility as we project. If our projections are off in a meaningful way, we project. And
Yes,
then we assess fees accordingly.
I think that you can look at the new statute and you can be assured.
That's a good thing in the statute.
Yes,
right?
I think you
Yeah.
can be assured that there was an expectation, that we don't have a crystal ball. We can't be perfect in our projections, and that there will need to be amendments made, and they provide a pathway to do that in the statute.
But it's not going to be a monthly thing. It takes time to build anyway, several years.
You certainly wouldn't want to do this on a monthly or even possibly, maybe an annual basis if needed, but ideally.
Now, we've talked about facilities that we built in the past that wouldn't qualify now, but nothing is retroactive here, right?
None of
I mean,
the
that's-
changes in necessary public services are retroactive. So those facilities that we built with impact fees, they were permitted as necessary public facilities, such as the court and open space, trails. Those were all permitted under the existing statute. It's just that the existing statute fees will go away on August 1 of 2014. And so the new fees come into place, and that's what's really going to dictate this, is that a number of facilities that we built in the past, as Cole and Katie have alluded to, and Brent, we won't in the future be building those facilities with impact fees. And that will be where council will have to make those decisions as to whether you want the facilities and how to pay for them. Now, moving on with the legislation, two other really significant changes in this legislation. Under the old structure, the planning horizon for projects could be basically unlimited. Some cities were looking at a 50-year horizon for certain projects. Now, for everything but utilities, there's a 10-year planning horizon. If you can't build it in 10 years, you can't charge a fee for it. And this becomes significant in a whole number of ways, which I'll be addressing. Utilities, it's 15 years. And that will pose some difficulties because many times you look at building a water treatment or wastewater treatment facility, you're looking at something that may have a 25 or 30-year period of construction because you only build the increments as you need them. And this we'll plan part of the facility in the current model, but you may not plan the entire facility, and then as the model gets adjusted, more increments of the facility will come. This becomes more problematic as well when we look at things like parks and streets, because those have a 10-year planning projection. So if you're not going to build it within 10 years, you can't include it in the infrastructure improvement plan. And there's a lot of items out there that from a developer standpoint, I think I'm going to build it within 10 years. The city looks at this and says, well, no, realistically, we don't think this is going to happen within 10 years. And the consequence is, if you overcharge on a fee, and this is again part of the administrative changes, you then have to refund for those items that you don't build. So if you include things in your plan and you don't build them and you don't adjust your plan, you have to refund not to the people who paid it, but to the then property owners who are living in the development. So it becomes very, very important in your infrastructure improvement plan to go through the very process that Katie spoke about, because you don't want to include things that you're not going to build. So moving on, I know this sounds kind of depressing, and so let's talk a little bit about what it means for the future. First, repayment agreements. Peoria has been very fortunate. For example, this council adopted as part of our code for most repayment agreements, there's a 10-year limitation. And the impact fee statute has a 10-year limitation. That was, I think, a great example of some very strong foresight by the council in doing that, because a number of cities are struggling with this because they have lengthy repayment agreements, and now you have a 10-year planning horizon. We will look at every repayment agreement, and I know that Katie has already, and we will address each one individually, and obviously the city wants to try to make sure that the parties in those agreements are made whole. But the way that the statute now works, that is always going to become a possibility that they will not, because of the fact that you now have these 10-year planning horizons, and conceivably you could have something like a development agreement that goes more than 10 years. And recently there was a city on the other side of the valley in the paper that had, I believe it was a 50-year development agreement. And they are now finding that because of the statute, the city's having to look at other ways to make that developer whole. I don't think we are going to have that kind of problem knowing our development agreements. But it is something out there. It's going to affect development in the future. because a lot of developers who would do repayment agreements where I advance infrastructure, I incur all those costs, and the city repays me, now that developer has to look at this and say, well, the city can only do this for 10 years, and to the extent that this isn't in the plan, the city can't repay me, and if it is in the plan, the city can collect those credits and repay me. My risk of not being repaid is suddenly increased. So I think it's going to actually really make repayment agreements for a lot of developers more problematic. It doesn't affect the existing ones, but it's going to really make this tool more problematic for the future.
Okay, Kathy and then Ron.
And then I'll address service areas, but let's take one area at a time with the question.
Okay.
Let's stop there and deal with this first.
So you've got a development agreement,
Yes,
which is a contract,
yes.
okay? And now legislation changes outside of that contract, and it makes portions of a contract null and void? How
No,
does
it doesn't necessarily, and this is where this gets really interesting from a legal standpoint. It's what litigation is made out of, is that you have a change in state law that suddenly changes all of the underlying assumptions parties went in doing a contract. When we do a contract, in very simple terms, it's a meeting of the minds. You and I do a contract, you have certain objectives, I have certain objectives, and we base the contract on those objectives. Suddenly, the state passes a law that changes all those objectives and they don't exist anymore. So consequently, the underlying basis for the contract is contract's still there, but the result of it may work out completely differently. That's where parties sit down and they negotiate and they say, okay, how do we address this? It's really a case-by-case analysis. We certainly will be doing that as time goes by under the new statute. We've been doing that already in the looking at things such as credits and things and building them into the infrastructure improvements plan. But it's going to be an issue that will be out there for the future because it undermines a lot of the assumptions parties had in entering into these agreements, and it's going to be an issue conceivably. I think we are so much better positioned, not just because of the 10-year limitation, but also because of how we've drafted our agreements. A lot of cities would pledge, for example, all of their money to satisfy a repayment agreement. We don't do things like that in Peoria. And we made a number of very, I think, good decisions as a city that will benefit us under the statute. But it is something we're going to look at. And if you have a question about a specific agreement, we can certainly talk about that in executive session. But I think we will be well positioned in most of our repayment agreements that the parties' expectations entering into those agreements will be addressed.
Did you add anything else?
No.
Mr.
Correct me if I'm not right, this is going to affect our development incentives, is that right? More than anything else?
The law doesn't directly affect your
In the
development.
future, I mean.
The law doesn't directly affect your development standards. Where this is going to come into is
I think, Steve, just, sorry to interrupt, I think you said development incentives.
incentives.
Yeah, so maybe a little more clarification on what types of incentives or what types of agreements?
Like we've done recently with certain companies, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to, I mean, we already have laws that address, for example, retail economic development incentives. This doesn't change that. We already have laws that generally address when we can do development agreements for economic incentives. This doesn't change that. Where it may change things is when you get large developments, the city's ability to reimburse for infrastructure constructed by the development may be less. And so I think where you're going to see the changes is future large developments. There's going to have to be a number of things that in the past we would reimburse for example, a new library. We can't reimburse for it. Now, the city may still want that new library, so there's going to have to be a lot more negotiation and discussion between us and the developer. So the answer is directly, no. Indirectly, yes.
So it's really land use development that we're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly is going to be something we, through this process and in the future, we'll be looking at.
Go ahead, Ms. Garland.
Is this going to affect, if the developer is charged impact fees, all right, if the developer does infrastructure for their development, and then the city comes in and oversizes that infrastructure, say with utilities, oversizes that for the rest of the region or for future
Yes.
growth, how is that impacted?
How that is impacted is obviously, first, the city has to have that within the infrastructure improvement plan, and the city has to be prepared to do it within the 15 years for it to be included within the infrastructure improvement plan. The second side of that becomes the city can grant credits to the extent that that oversizing is necessary to serve the service area. Where the city before could grant credits was the city had broad discretion in the past. If we're doing some oversizing of a water line because we need it to serve the service area, and some we don't need it to serve that service area, but it would improve our distribution systems for other service areas because by having maybe a larger water line out of a plant going south, the southern area that maybe had, that's not part of the service area, but maybe had some distribution issues would be benefited. We're going to have to look at that oversizing and make a judgment as to which part is a result of the burden caused by new development in the service area and which part is a result of simply making the city's system better. That is something that your staff has been working with the various parts of the city staff as well as the outside interested parties in looking at those very things. And it becomes a very, very complicated analysis, quite honestly, because you take a road may benefit a service area, a road may benefit other parts of the city as well. And how do you do that? And that is the analysis that your staff has been going through for quite a number of months, as well as having consultants assist us in that process. And this gets us to the last area, which is service areas. Now, as I mentioned, service areas in the past, for example, we had a number of things that we had citywide service areas, and that was perfectly permitted under the old statute. Now, service areas are directly tied to that area where there's a substantial nexus. And a substantial nexus is a really fancy legal term. What it basically means is there's a direct connection between the burden of new development and that area and the improvements in the infrastructure improvement plan for that area. And so we now are looking at service areas where we can identify those direct connections. And what that means is that you could conceivably have service areas of the city where there's no substantial nexus, no direct connection between the burden of new development and the infrastructure needed in that service area, and therefore there is no fee. There will be other areas of the city where there will be a fee, where in the past, quite honestly, we operated much more of a unitary service area system, and we had fees across the city. And that is going to be one of the changes because you really don't have a unitary service area system anymore under the statute. You have this direct connection between the burden of new development and the service area.
And does that service area have a size limit? 2 miles?
No,
5
it doesn't have a
miles?
size limit. It's really based on what is the direct connection. Conceivably, in some areas, you could have, particularly in North Peoria, a very, very large service area because there's very, very little infrastructure, and each piece of infrastructure could benefit a significant service area. Conversely, in South Peoria, and I use that only because it's easier for people to think of, in other parts of Peoria that are really developed, you might have a very smaller service area. And so it's not so much geographic. You want to think of it in terms of area and burden of development and infrastructure required versus geographic or versus size.
And we have maps coming up that show for the various fee categories where those service areas are proposed, recommended to exist, and they're different based upon each fee category. So we can go into a little bit more detail of that as we go through the
Okay,
fees.
so that's the new definition of zones then. We're talking about it in a whole different way than we used to when we had the 3 zones in the city.
Absolutely, that's exactly
Yes.
right.
Okay, and those take into consideration the expense for development in that area.
Right, the projects that are necessary to support the development
growth
within that particular area.
And how much more it would cost to do that project than it would maybe in some other area.
Whether a project is even necessary in another area, right? So we'll get it, can we wait and then
Yes,
go
we
through a
can.
little of that, and if you have questions, we'll get into more of that detail.
Strings?
Yeah, this is kind of, you talked about this nexus. So you're building a lot of homes in a certain area, and they have their own streets, but then they connect to larger streets, and we may have to increase the capacity on those larger streets. We can include that in the impact, right?
Yes, I'll get into that a little
So-
bit, but that typically it's those larger regional items of infrastructure like arterial streets versus collectors and residential, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but you're exactly correct.
There may be in undeveloped areas where there needs to be significant new roadway construction because of the new requirements of what the development requires in terms of infrastructure. There may be infrastructure projects where impact fees can support a portion of that project, and other funding sources may be necessary to pay for part of the project as well. Because, probably shouldn't get into this, but if you have a large, let's say it's
You're going
it's
back to the
2
area.
lanes each direction of a roadway, you may not need 4 lanes of highway to support the growth in a particular area, but we may choose to build a 4-lane, or the developer may choose to build a 4-lane roadway system in a certain area. A portion that would be eligible for inclusion in the impact fee calculation. A portion of it may not be. It starts getting in the technicalities of how it's calculated, the level of service in that area versus other areas of the city.
I understand it's complicated, but I'm not talking about building more lanes there, but we have to build further down because that traffic goes to arterials, and we have to increase the capacity on those arterials that may be many miles away. And you just said that is something we can consider.
Yeah, typically what you look at more specifically on arterials is the arterials needed to move traffic to a major freeway or a major highway of some sort. So our Loop 303 versus our Loop 101, maybe even Grand Avenue, that kind of thing. Those are our major roadways in Peoria. So you are looking at that, and yes, there are some maybe what you call downhill impacts that come from new growth that's occurring in one area and how it impacts other areas. And the surface areas sometimes, address some of that. But you also have to look at what portion. You always have to ask yourself the question, for example, in the southern portion of the city, do we need more lanes of roadway in the southern portion of the city because growth that's occurring in the city, or is it because of the growth that's occurring outside of the city? And if it's the growth that's outside of the city, then we really don't need, those aren't really growth-related, City of Peoria growth-related lanes. So those wouldn't be included. Doesn't mean we don't need to do it and that we don't need to find some way to pay for it, but it wouldn't be part of the impact fee analysis.
But you're going to consider all of that.
Yes.
In the best way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, finally, one more point on service areas before we move on to another area is, in the past, a city could establish in an impact fee area a higher level of service with the commitment that sometime in the future, whenever that might be, the city would eventually bring its existing service area up to that level. That we can no longer do under the statute. In essence, we establish a level of service for the entire city, and the impact fees in the new service area, in the areas, are based upon the level of service within the existing city. So the fact of the matter is, if you have a low level of service in your existing city, that is going to impact that fee, because you can't say, well, if we think of level of service as just sort of a number, we know when you go to the doctor, they talk about pain, and 10 is high and 1 is low. Think of level of service sort of the same thing for just purposes of this discussion. If our level of service in the existing city is a 3, under the old statute, you could say, yes, it's a 3, but we want a 9, and so we're going to calculate our fees on a 9 with the promise to bring our 3 up to a 9. Now, if our level of service is a 3, it's going to be a 3, and that will dictate what the new fees are. So it's important to think of service area as also level of service. And again, Katie will get into that in some of the existing and future service areas and how level of service impacts that. Now, they say that there's a few things certain in life, death and taxes. So now we're going to talk about taxes for just a minute. It's sort of fitting we're at the end of the year. And there's another piece of legislation that came about in 2012, a year after the impact fee legislation, that is also, while it's not related to impact fees, it has a significant impact on our capital plan. And this was Proposition 117. And it went to the voters and was approved by the voters in 2012. And I'm going to use a couple of terms, and I'll explain those first. In Arizona, all property has a full cash value. And the easy definition of full cash value, that's what the county assessor thinks your real property is worth. Now, you may look at it and say, I don't think it's worth that. That's fine. It's just what the county assessor thinks it's worth. What that number is important is that tax rates are all based on assessed value, which is a percentage of that full cash value number. Full cash value, that's what the assessor thinks it's worth. Assessed value, that's the rate your taxes are calculated on. Now, if you really want to someday get into all the intricacies of that, come see me and we can talk about all of that, but it's a lengthy discussion, and I'd recommend several cups of coffee beforehand. Proposition 117 states that beginning in 2015, the assessed value increase on any property is limited to 5% a year. You're thinking, oh, well, that 5% a year, that's okay. Well, traditionally in Arizona, when we've had real estate declines, we've had them sort of, think of a V, a steep drop and a steep increase. And the assessors' values are about a year and a half behind the market. So if the decline began in 2008, it was 2009, 2010 when the assessors' values show that decline. Under Prop 117, the values won't go back up on a steep incline. They'll go up on a very gradual slope. So what does that really mean? What that means is that traditionally cities, because values would go back up on a steep incline, would have very fast growth in assessed value. Assessed value is what we base our ability to issue general obligation bonds on. Depending on the category, we can either issue 20% of assessed value or 6% of assessed value. Well, if your assessed value goes up on a very slow slope, the same will happen with your ability to issue general obligation bonds. It will go up on a very slow slope. And that means that if you wish to issue more general obligation bonds, and you have the capacity, the only way to do that is to increase the tax rate. Because since the slope is going up very slow, you may have capacity to issue within that area, but because the values are not going up, your tax rate also is going up on that same slow slope. So the end answer about Proposition 117 is going to be, A, it's going to impact the city's ability to issue additional general obligation bonds, and B, if you wish to issue general obligation bonds, you may well have to look at the choice of increasing your secondary property tax rate in order to do so. And those really are the two things you want to keep in mind. Now, how that impacts is that we've just talked about impact fees not being available for certain things and general obligation bonds being available. this is going to impact that choice. And Councilmember Ames had a question.
Yes, 5% going up, there's nothing about going down though, right? It can just go down steeply and that's it?
It could go down steeply, in fact.
And that's the new base, at
And the
least
new base-
after a couple of years, right? Or a year and a half, you said, and then it can only go up 5%.
I can only go up 5%. So a good example.
Don't some cities have their statutes talks about up and down, and their tax rate
I think it
associated
would
with that, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it would have made much more sense to have had a nice gradual downward slope. If you take, for example, a typical neighborhood like I live in Peoria, you might have had your values drop by 50% over that 3-year period. So if the value was $200,000 and it drops to $100,000, and it can only go up 5% a year, 5% of $100,000 is $5,000, it could take conceivably 20 years to get back up to the top of that V. And that's where you hit the nail right on the head. There's no restriction on the downward slope. So everything can go down the hill really quickly, but there's no way to get back up. And as I mentioned, the end answer to this is going to impact on the ability of the city to use the tool of general obligation bonds to fill in some of the gaps of impact fees without making choices about tax rates.
Does this apply to schools as well? Applies to everyone?
It's going to affect the schools significantly because schools are even more than cities are property tax
Tied to
supported.
property tax.
And schools are going to be subject to the same issue of the values aren't going to be going up very quickly and their ability to get additional revenue on the incline is going to be severely limited.
So that puts a finer point on what I was saying in the introduction, how these elements working together constrain our ability to fund some of these critical improvements in the future, and it pressurizes our existing revenue source because these facilities will be competing with everything else in your capital and operating budgets going forward. And we're going to begin to feel that straight away.
And we're talking strictly here about the secondary tax, right? Yeah.
Well, it will affect both because keep in mind your primary...
It affects both, but in terms of bonds,
Yes,
it's the same.
bonds are secondary. Primary is just simply your general fund revenues. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brent and Katie.
So no more good news, right?
No, there really isn't. Other than if you have any other questions, I'm certainly happy to answer those.
Anything else before we move on to the next section? We've covered a lot of material so far.
I guess.
All right. Well, maybe I can try to liven this up a little bit and give you maybe a little bit more interesting, possibly, or more exciting things to talk about. I wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at the process for updating impact fees and really try to help sort of simplify what a very complex process is to give you some better understanding and maybe offer some clarification. I've really tried to boil this down to 3 very simple steps with a final output of fee levels. So when we look at this, the 3 major elements, and I think Brent touched on this already, was we looked at our growth projections, the capital needs that are driven by those growth projections, and again, the service areas and how they play and how service levels and service areas impact the fee levels. When we talk about growth projections, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time. We're talking about commercial and residential growth projections. How many single-family residential units, multifamily residential units, commercial square footage do we believe is going to occur in the city over the 10-year planning period? And that itself is, a pretty extensive process to kind of think, and especially to think that far ahead. But it has resulted in a lot of really good discussion, I believe, with our stakeholders. We've spent a considerable amount of time talking through this with our developers, understanding their projects, the timing of their projects, and the infrastructure requirements that they believe they will need in order to make their projects happen. And we've also looked at a number of different sources to try to understand, kind of give ourselves a bellwether to work off of from we've looked at MAG's growth projections. We've looked at our historical growth, what's happened between 2000 and 2010, and kind of where did we sit within the overall growth market in the metro area. And we also really hone this down to Peoria specific. So to your question, Ms. Carlott, is that yes, absolutely, we look at growth projections every single year. They're a key tenet to everything we do, and we are always looking at that particularly, and we can do a pretty good job those first 3 to 5 years. You start getting a little further out, it gets a little bit more tricky. I think I have developers sitting in the audience right now who would probably agree with that statement, but I think we've come up with a real collaborative process to come up with some consensus on a forecast going forward with our growth projections. Capital needs, we have held several meetings over the past month or so looking at the capital facilities needed. Our process this time was what we did this year was we took what we believed those capital facility needs were going to be based upon our original growth projections and put those out there and let the development community kind of react to that. And that was helpful because it gave us a baseline to start from. And then they spent some time talking with us about what they believe worked within those projections and those projects and what didn't work and what they believe needed to be included or maybe what didn't need to be included. And we spent a lot of time talking about that for all the various fee categories that we had. The result of that is that I want to be clear that the IIP, or the growth projects that we've identified, is not our capital program. Those are two different things. Our capital program could include some of those projects, but our capital program includes a lot of other projects as well. This is only those projects needed to serve that growth or the growth that's occurring in the city. And they're only development-related projects. And even more than that, they're ones that fall within what we'd call more regional projects, or like roads of regional significance, or major water, wastewater facility needs, such as treatment facilities, new capacity needed, major transmission lines, those types of things. We also looked at service areas and talked with all of our development stakeholders about some of our recommendations on service areas and what that would mean. Meaning, in some service areas, we don't have growth-related projects identified. That would mean there would not be a fee in that service area. And I'll go through those with you a little bit later. And we also wanted to try to tie service area boundaries to maybe what we might call those natural boundaries. For example, we talked, I think, at the last time I met with you, we talked about water and wastewater. And on wastewater, the natural boundary is kind of the Agua Fria River. You usually don't cross wastewater lines, through a river. So, that's a natural boundary to kind of do an east-west service area, which is what we're proposing. So I'll go through some of that. But I think the big takeaway from this and from this slide is that all of those things combined really create an output. And the output is what those fee levels are. So the fee level, that's just an output of all of this work related to those projects, those growth assumptions in those service areas, and what all that means in a calculation. So that's really what I was hoping the slide could kind of give you an overview of. Brent talked about this, so I won't go through all of them, but we did have significant participation from our developer stakeholders. All of them were very helpful in not only educating city staff on their projects and what they believe their projects will look like and what they believe they need for their projects, but also listening to the city and understanding kind of from our perspective, what level of risk are we willing to take in terms of some of these new legislative, conditions that provisions that we're having to work under. So I think that was a really good give and take with them. We talked through our growth projections, both commercial and residential. We talked through, like I said, the infrastructure plans, the service areas, and some of the fee methodologies.
And that's kind of a continuing process.
Yes, and that's continuing. I mean, I don't expect that we will not have these meetings. These meetings will continue until probably council approves the fee ordinance, which is expected maybe in later April of next year. So, but one of the key outcomes that came, sure.
Katie, before you leave that slide, Arizona State Land Department, is their land exempt from any of this? Are they an exception in any way?
No, they are not an exception. Certainly, everyone who came to the table has a variety of interests, right? When they come in and talk to us, and in a lot of cases, those are opposing interests. And so we have to kind of work through those. I mean, state land has indicated that they don't like high fees. I mean, I don't know if anyone does. And they are concerned about encumbering state land with costly fees or repayment agreements or things along that line. So we certainly understand their position and where they are. They are not exempt from impact fees. As they sell their land and that land comes into the city to develop, there's no intent that they understand that there's no intent that they would be exempt from impact fees.
But they are basically exempt from repayment agreements.
I believe in that situation, they have expressed that they are not interested in, quote, encumbering their land with repayments. Repayments are a little bit different. Repayments are if, for example, if a developer is putting in a roadway and it has to cross state land in order to get to the natural next connected roadway, right? They don't like having repayments put on that property that would then, in their eyes, devalue their land. So we have worked with them that the city in general, we've said that the city will not put on repayments, but that doesn't stop developers from having an opportunity to work with state land to have repayments on the property.
And it's important to note for state land, this is really a constitutional issue for them. When Arizona became a state in the Enabling Act, it prohibits the state land department from engaging in any action to place a lien, encumbrance, or any kind of restriction on state land that reduces its value. So from their standpoint, this isn't, I want the council to understand, state land is not being difficult here. It's an issue for them of a legal requirement under the Enabling Act, which I completely understand, having been involved in litigation on the Enabling Act, where state land is at. State land has to do this. I think, frankly, I would characterize our relationship with state land. I just happened to meet with the commissioner last week. It's a very good relationship, and I know that they've been participating in this process and as an active participant. So they're doing it because they have to, because the Constitution says so.
I just wanted to share this, and you have kind of, this is an aggregate of some of what you had included in your council packet, which was kind of a product that came out of all of those stakeholder meetings, and this is just representing the single-family residential units that we came to an agreement or a consensus through all of our stakeholder meetings as to what we would project over the 10-year period in single-family residential units. What's important to note here is that that's basically the total of about 17,660 new residential units over the 10-year period, and that equates to roughly about 47,000 new residents in the city. So assuming these growth projections do occur in the timing and in the manner in which our developer stakeholders in the city, in our viewpoint, can agree with these projections based on what we know today, that's a considerable amount of infrastructure that's going to be needed to provide services to that many new residents in the city. I wanted to also just kind of show you generally, this sort of breaks out for you what some of the major developments are in the city. A number of these, all of these have been involved in one way or another through the stakeholder process, some of them more than others, but this generally gives you a breakout of those 17,000 units and kind of where they're going to occur in the city. So you can see that obviously our central and northern portion of the cities are where the primary single-family growth is going to occur. So that's, just kind of gives you a visual to work off of. So questions and discussions on the growth assumptions. The first important piece that we worked through.
Go ahead, Ron.
I noticed that you drop off of those last few years I know it's hard to go past 5 years.
Exactly.
Anyway, but
exactly.
It's kind of being conservative there?
I don't know if I would call that conservative. I think that when we looked at those development projects that we know today, the Saddlebacks, the Lake Pleasant Heights, the Vistancia, the Trilogy West, Tierra del Rio, Alora Vita. I mean, we had all of those kind of, the Meadows. I mean, that one's going pretty quick right now, right? Yeah. We had all of those folks kind of talking to us about what they believe their projections would be. I think this was sort of an interesting mix because when we did it the first time and we kind of put all their projections in and we looked at it, we had years in the early years, as early as next year, in the 2,000, 3,000, units, and then it was just dropping off the further you go, because just like us, they have trouble kind of seeing even beyond the 5 to 6 year horizon. You know, they certainly can get those first 5 years probably pretty well, but it's beyond that where it gets a little harder. So it is going down, but again, we're required by statute to update these fees and update our land use assumptions officially every 5 years, if not sooner. So, you know, you'll see a different assumption, I'm sure, 5 years from now.
Ms. Rivera?
How does multifamily play a role in this?
Multifamily is, we did do some multifamily assumptions, and I think in your packet you see that in the list that we have here. Multifamily was at the table, and they didn't necessarily provide, when I say multifamily, the association that represents multifamily. We didn't have any multifamily developers at the table. They did not come to the stakeholder meetings, but through our planning department and working through our economic development department, we certainly know what some of those are, at least in the early phases. Vistancia has some multifamily planned within their overall project plan. So we also have multifamily units included. This isn't showing it here, but we do have them included as well.
Thank you.
I sort of have a question. So far, everything I've heard is a limiter to growth. You're reducing our impact fees that we're able to collect. You take away our go bond ability to back up the loss of impact fees. How can we look at possibly sustaining a growth of 17,000? It's going to cost us money for the developers to put in their developments. So at what point do we draw that line and say, no, we can't afford you?
That's a much larger policy decision, I think. I don't think I can answer that question.
Good answer, Katie. No, I don't know that there is an answer to that, Mayor.
That was rhetorical.
Other than it really is, fundamentally a policy issue, because I think you're summarizing the impact of these things playing off of one another.
Yeah, I mean, with 117, where your 5% drops, your go bonds go to hell in a handbasket. It costs us more to allow them to develop. At some point, and I won't be on the council anymore, but at some point, the council is going to have to say, no, you can't develop in our city right now. We can't afford you. That's just a comment in passing, never mind.
Okay, any more questions on the growth assumptions? I'll move on that. So the second piece of that was looking at the capital needs that are driven by growth. And so we, again, spent that time working with them and understanding it. These are the categories, the fee categories that we've included as part of the update to the impact fee. These include major utility and transportation infrastructure, obviously, parks and quality of life projects, public safety facilities, and really projects that help support our economic development opportunities in the city. So when we looked at this, we're looking kind of at all of that, and we're also looking on the other side, as Brent mentioned earlier, it's great to put a lot of projects in a plan and say, we're going to build all these things. We also have to consider the other side of that, which is that once these are in place, we have a responsibility to operate and maintain them. And what is our ability or capacity to be able to do that within the 10-year program as well? So all of that comes into kind of the discussion surrounding these areas.
Okay. Are these categories inclusive of everything, or is there an other too?
No, there is no other. I mean, it was very specific in this statute.
This is it.
It'd be great if there was another category, but
We got to work within these categories.
We've got to work within these categories.
How specifically are they defined?
They're very specifically defined. For example, library is defined as a library not to exceed 10,000 square feet. So you can look at a 10,000 square foot library as being within your infrastructure improvements plan. But if you build a 30,000 square foot library, which many cities build a branch library that size, that other 20,000 square feet isn't part of your impact fee model. It's going to have to be dealt with through some other financing mechanism. And where in the past as well, lots of the interior furnishings and items could be included within the impact fee. You're going to, again, be limited on that. So what you're going to find is that a number of facilities, you may build a piece with impact fees, and then you're going to have to fund another piece with some other source of revenue, or elect to have just a 10,000 square foot library, and that's it.
Where's drainage Does it fall under one of those three water categories, or is it exempt?
We haven't traditionally, we don't have a impact fee category for drainage. I will tell you that the statute does allow for an impact fee for stormwater.
Okay.
We have not, we haven't done that in the past, and we weren't necessarily recommending to do that in this update. It is something that in the future, if we want to look at, we certainly could.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, do look at it at some point.
Just very quickly, wanted to just say this piece, which I think I get a lot of questions about this from the developers as well as others who have an interest in impact fees, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. What you're seeing in these pictures are kind of the difference between what we'd call regional infrastructure and local infrastructure. Regional infrastructure on the left there is a picture of, obviously, the Happy Valley Bridge, if you couldn't tell. And so that's a pretty regional roadway, and it is included in our impact fee analysis. On the flip side, on the right side there, you're seeing what's considered more of a collector or residential street right outside here of City Hall. And you can see that would not be what we would include in terms of local infrastructure in an impact fee program. So when developers are asking that question, they're kind of asking from the standpoint of, what's included in impact fees? They're thinking of everything they have to build, not just the pieces that we typically look at, which are the major arterials, the major water or wastewater lines that are above, say, 16-inch for water and above 12-inch for wastewater, or whatever those thresholds are. Instead, we look at more of the regional. We look at the regional infrastructure. So I want to spend a little bit of time going through each of the fee categories, and after each one, I'll give a chance for you to ask some questions about it, and I'll just give you kind of the high-level discussion about these items. Transportation is a really important fee to the city of Peoria. It's traditionally our highest fee. It's also one of the more complex fees that we have. And it's one that has a lot of interest from our development partners in terms of understanding this, because typically, as development is coming into the city, these are the types of things that must occur before they can even issue that first building permit. They must put the roadways in. In terms of the service areas, you can see the map on the right. We are looking at 3 service areas for our transportation fees. That is not unlike what we currently have in our impact fee structure. We have an area in this, the only difference right now is that our service area for the south service area, the boundary is at Bell Road. We're looking to move that to Deer Valley Road. And that makes some sense because south of Deer Valley Road, we do not have any growth-related projects identified south of that line in the city. So we would be proposing that because of that, there would be no fee for transportation south of Deer Valley Road. In the northern part of the city, north of Deer Valley Road and east of the Agua Fria, we're proposing a central zone, and west of the Agua Fria, a north zone. And, of course, the projects that are associated with all of that.
Maybe a couple of examples.
Some of the projects that would be included, I mentioned Happy Valley Road. Lone Mountain Road would be one, a future roadway. We would El Mirage Road that goes through Vistancia and all the way up, and ultimately connects at I think it's Twin Buttes or El Mirage all the way up to
State Route 74.
Well, State Route 74 across to Bullard, but let's, so, there's going to be some curvature there. Westland Road, connections to Loop 303 at Lone Mountain and at Westland, things like that are included. Any questions on transportation?
I'm confused again with the zones.
Sure.
Because of the old way we talked about zones, now we're talking about zones in a new way. So reiterate that for me again.
Okay. So in the current impact fee study, we had created an artificial central zone to some degree. And the reason I say it was artificial is because we calculated the fees for everything north of Bell Road and came up with a fee for everything north of Bell Road. And then we bifurcated that zone and charged less than the maximum supportable fee in the central zone and charged the maximum supportable fee in the north zone. That was a council policy decision on fee levels, and that was an intentional decision made by council. So what we're proposing now is that because of what Steve talked about, because we're asked to look at these, really kind of show the benefit a more closer nexus and a closer benefit to the area where growth is occurring and the projects that are helping to support that growth, it sort of creates the need for more zones. I'm not going to say in all cases it does, but in this case, I think a natural dividing line would be the Agua Fria, and there's certainly things that are happening east of the Agua Fria and roadways that really support the Elora Vitas, the Sonora Mountain Ranches, the Rock Springs, the West Wings, the Cibola Vista, you know, all of those areas, and then there's sort of a clear distinction about the other roadways that are really truly supporting that area west of the Agua Fria. And I think that's a natural boundary, and I think it's an important one that we are showing that we're trying to keep that benefit area slightly smaller. So that will result in different fees for those areas.
Instead of this being a policy designed to control how growth occurs in our city, this is a policy that adheres the nexus.
This is more in line with the statute and what the intent of the new legislation was.
All right, so it keeps the costs within a realm that is tied to that new growth.
Yes.
That's tied to the growth and the burdens that growth causes.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on transportation?
So what we talked about earlier, that central zone, some of the development might pay for increased capacity down in the south zone.
Because south of Deer Valley, we're not including any roadways that, we don't believe there are any roadway improvements that need to occur south of Deer Valley that are driven by growth that's happening in Peoria. That was kind of my point before. Really, the improvements that have to occur south of Deer Valley are due to the growth that's going to occur east and west of us. And so those cities, as they build, because if you go back to that one where I showed you, a lot of the Peoria growth is not occurring in the southern part of the city, and we have the ability to serve with the roadways that we have. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to expand those roadways for growth that's happening outside.
Pass-through traffic.
Pass-through traffic,
particularly
exactly.
on Bell.
Yep, on Bell, absolutely on Bell. Yeah, so, so we're not proposing a fee, so they really aren't, there really isn't that downstream in that case from what's happening in the central area.
That's not really addressed in the law? Because it's a regional impact.
It is a regional
and
impact.
We're part of the region, and it impacts us where it impacts us, right?
I don't think in the law it's specifically addressed.
It really doesn't address that. You have, and it wouldn't allow you to charge for impact fees for outside influences. So, for example, we could not adjust our impact fees upward because the South Zone is receiving lots of additional traffic from Surprise and El Mirage. We're not able to do that. We have to look in each zone as, is growth in that zone causing a burden that the city's having to incur? There may be burdens in the South Zone, but it's not from the growth in the South Zone, and therefore we're not able to adjust the fees accordingly.
Jeff just whispered in my ear. One of the tools that we have available that we've used to address some of that is the transportation sales tax. So that's an option also to address some of those needs.
Okay, I'll move on to water. Thanks, Andy. Move on to water and wastewater. He was there. You could have asked. This was your chance, right?
Why did you use those colors?
Now we'll have Bill come up. Next, moving on is we'll talk a little bit about water and wastewater. And probably the best place to start in this discussion is to kind of refer to the map on here where we talk about the service areas. And I touched on this the last time we talked, and our service area recommendations are not changing from the last time we talked, where we said kind of south of Bell Road, that area is served, from a water perspective, is served primarily from the Greenway Water Treatment Facility, and north of Bell Road, we primarily have the Pyramid Peak Facility, Pyramid Peak Facility, sorry, I always want to say Pinnacle Peak, but it's Pyramid Peak Facility that is serving a lot of the needs there. And of course, shown on here sort of in a darker shade in the blue is the Vistancia CFD, and I think that's important, back to that point that we can't charge impact fees for items that are included as part of the Vistancia CFD. They actually have a reduced fee currently, only paying for those items that are outside of what they have in their CFD. So I put it on the map just for reference so that you can kind of see how much area that includes. The big items here are that in the north part of the city, north of Bell Road, where Pyramid Peak is providing the primary treatment capacity, is that we have a lot of infrastructure needs to serve those 8,000 plus units that we're showing west of the Agua Fria River in that northwest portion of the city. So those infrastructure needs are driving the idea that there's going to be a higher fee in that area because the needs for that area are going to be greater than the needs for the area south of Bell Road. And in south of Bell Road, really, we're talking about the Greenway Water Treatment Plant, like I said, and some capacity that's available there that is available to serve those new units that are going to be coming in south of Bell Road. So that fee is probably going to be decreased from what the current fee levels are.
I have a question. Why don't we split the north to a central north like we did with transit? Because the needs on the east-west of Agua Fria differ. And the source of your water differs. Or
Mayor
is it
Barrett,
just because we have to keep crossing the river?
Mayor Barrett, what we're seeing is I'm looking at this in terms of treatment capacity. That's how I'm approaching this question. There's a need for additional treatment capacity in the north part of Peoria. Certainly, we have the Pyramid Peak plant in place. We have 23% ownership in that plant. And that currently serves a large portion of the currently developed areas within North Peoria. But we still have other areas that are going to continue to grow, and those are the Alora Vitas and some of the areas within Camino al Lago, the state lands there. Those things that are north-south along the Lake Pleasant Parkway, probably for the near term, south of Loop 303. But those needs and their per unit demands are really going to be the same as what they're going to be west of the Agua Fria. So I think that the nexus is there with respect to those needs. Now, there are some water lines that are going to cross the Agua Fria, and one might argue that, well, that really benefits the people on the west side of the Agua Fria. But alternatively, I can bring water the other direction. I can use the wells that I have in place west of the Agua Fria in Vistancia. I've got 10 wells there. I can bring water the other way if I have a treatment plant that is down. So I see these as very much regional facilities, and I think that they're arguably justified for serving the entire north area.
Okay.
And just as a side point to that, I think that if you go back to that map where I kind of showed where those growth, it was about 8,000 units both in the central and, in that central zone as well as that northwest zone. So you're seeing similar growth happening in both those areas over the 10-year period. Talk a little bit about wastewater. Again, referring to the map here, this is where, again, we're using that natural boundary of the Agua Fria River as sort of the east and west boundary for wastewater. We have Jomax facility, the Jomax Water Reclamation Facility that serves kind of west of the Agua Fria. And east of the Agua Fria, we have the Beardsley Water Reclamation Facility and the Butler Water Reclamation Facility that are serving that side. So east of the Agua Fria, we are anticipating, because again, those facilities are in place, and that there is going to be, we don't have the expansion cost to some of those facilities associated with that fee is going to be less than what we currently have. Preliminarily, it's going to be less than what we're currently charging. West of the Agua Fria, however, we do have some needs to expand in order to provide the Jomax facility, in order to provide the treatment capacity for those areas, or the collection for those areas, and that fee is likely to increase over our current fee levels. Any questions? Do you want to go back to that?
Are there any assumptions of building another facility? Or what assumptions are you using for growth here? Just the water lines coming across from Pyramid Peak? Or are you talking about Phoenix, or are you talking about a new
Some
facility?
of the types of projects that are
Any of
included for
those?
water and
Yeah.
wastewater. I don't know, Bill, if you want to talk about the big ones generally?
Yeah, I mixed up.
Yeah, our strategy right now for water treatment capacity is to expand Pyramid Peak by 10 million gallons per day. Coincidentally, just last week, the Glendale City Council approved an engineering consulting contract to analyze what the needs are to improve the plant to preserve the current capacity, but also they're asking their engineer to do a cost estimate as to what it would take to expand that plant by 10 million gallons a day. And that was something we specifically asked them for, with the intent of using that to sharpen our pencil with respect to what we've got in our budget right now, and then use that as the basis for a potential intergovernmental agreement to expand the plant to provide that as our water supply within this 10, 15-year time horizon. That's not going to be the ultimate supply. We're going to need to do more in the future, but within the period of time we're talking about. So associated with that, there are pipeline improvements, pump station improvements to move the water from Pyramid Peak across the Agua Fria, as we were talking about a minute ago. So that's the overall strategy with respect to water. With respect to wastewater, this slide alludes to it. We'll continue to expand the Beardsley Water Reclamation Facility as necessary to serve those areas, and that's primarily everything east of the Agua Fria, north of Beardsley Road. Likewise, we would expand the Peoria portion of the Jomax plant. The Jomax plant was funded partially with CFD funds and partially with direct City of Peoria impact fee funded expansion. But as we grow into that capacity, we'll need to expand that yet again. And so that would take care of the capacities that we see west of the Agua Fria. Ultimately, there's another treatment plant that's necessary in Saddleback, but that's outside that time horizon.
Okay, so that was the question that I was wondering about. So you might have that assumption, but it's outside the 15 years.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me.
Okay, all right, so it's not in this plan at all. Thanks.
Good. All right, I'll move into the parks category and just wanted to talk a little bit about parks. Parks includes both neighborhood and community parks. There is some very specific limitations associated with parks in the new legislation. The biggest one being that parks can only be the parks that are less than 30 acres can be included as part of the impact fee analysis and included in the calculation of the fee. So that does limit. Again, that immediately puts sort of for those parks that we have that are larger than 30 acres. Everything beyond that 30-acre cost is now going to have to be funded by some other source. So that is one that does immediately impact our ability to do some of those or finance some of those projects. If you look at the service area map on the right, did you have a question you want to ask real quick? Okay. If you look at the service area map on the right, it's very similar to what we had in the past with the 3 zones. However, we are looking at, since there are no growth-related projects, similar to what I talked about with the streets, there are no growth-related projects or projects that are being needed and driven by growth that's occurring within the city, in the southern part of the city, we are recommending that we bifurcate Zone 1 into 2 zones, and I'm showing them here as Zone 1-1 and Zone 1-2, and that we do not charge a fee. We're recommending that we do not charge a fee south of the Bell Road line in Zone 1-1. We do also anticipate that the fees in the other zones will decrease, and that's for obvious reasons, will decrease from what our current fee levels are in all the remaining 3 zones based upon some of the limitations.
Mr. Rivera.
In situations where you have new construction on parks that are less than 30 acres, what happens in that situation?
If a park is less than 30 acres, we certainly can include all of that park and all of those amenities in the costs associated with those amenities as part of our IIP or our capital plan.
Even for parks that have been built 15, 20 years ago, or that only applies to
No, this is only applying to new parks that are being generated or being built as a result of new development that's requiring those parks in order to maintain our
What if the park is not sustaining the new any surrounding growth?
If the park is not
let's say a park that was built 30, 40 years ago is not sustaining, the neighborhoods around the area.
Meaning it's not from a maintenance standpoint, it's not?
No. For example, there's some parks in the district that I represent that were built 30, 40 years ago. If they're less than 30 acres and new additions have to be made, more bathrooms, more amenities, what happens in those situations?
Yeah, in those situations, impact fees wouldn't be the source to be able to use to fund that. You'd have to find other sources to be able to fund that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we've got a capital improvement program right now that's 10 years, and it's fully funded. So now we have to go back in and change those funding sources for our CIP. Are you in the process of doing that, and will that be ready by the time it's time for us to discuss the budget for this coming year?
Yes, that's actually, all departments have submitted their requests, and we are going through what we call the balancing process right now, which is basically aligning sources of funding based upon what we know, and we're making some assumptions about what we believe will collect in impact fees over the 10-year period based on our preliminary fees anyway, and assigning those funding sources to those projects as appropriate. So if it can be funded with impact fees, and I'll give you probably your big example, Community Park 3. Currently in the capital program is funded with GO bonds. To the extent that we will have impact fees collected and available to pay for up to 30 acres of that, or up to a certain, up to that limitation, we certainly would like to use impact fees as a source to pay for that and free up some of that GO capacity.
Okay, and in addition to that, since our capacity is going to be lowered, it's very possible that the things that are now in the CIP for 2015 might be moved out to forever.
Well, and I would say that our capacity, we're not projecting our capacity is going to be lowered. We're just projecting that our capacity is not going to grow as quickly as maybe the values, the assessed valuation
grows. And I was
grows.
kidding when I
Yes.
said forever. What I
Right.
meant was an extended period of time, right? So 2015 might change to 2019.
Yeah, it has the potential of pushing projects out, to say that another way. Now, we're early, as Katie mentioned, in that whole mix of looking at needs against available revenue, but that's absolutely a possibility. Again, back to this.
I thought you were going to give
I
us
sound like this
better
broken.
news here. I thought this was going to be the better part of our presentation.
The other piece we look at, as you all know, is when we go through that capital planning process, we look at whatever those projects are. If there's an operating cost associated with those, we identify those, and we look at what that requires, and again, the council's priority in terms of some of those projects versus other council interests. So that'll be part of, we'll talk a little bit about that maybe Friday. And again, we're going to be discussing that as we go through the operating and capital budget.
I think the way to think of it, we're not necessarily predicting or projecting at this point any given impact, because what it really means, what this means, and the changes in the economy that we're still dealing with from the recession, what it really means is ultimately there's going to be some fairly difficult choices that the council will need to make in the budgets over the next few years with respect to one type of expenditure or another. I mean, the characterization or the difference from where we were before the downturn and before these changes in law is fairly dramatic. In those days, we were able to one degree or another, fund most of the things that the council, those councils in those days wanted, and it maybe was just a matter of timing as to when that would occur. Now the pressures are more acute, and so the choices are going to be more, I think, acute for you as well over the next few years, foreseeable future, at any rate.
Ron, and then Bill.
Yeah, were impact fees used at all for Pioneer Park, or that wasn't
No,
because of growth?
Right. Pioneer Park was not included in our impact fee analysis when we did
And
the...
so we paid it under other things.
Yes.
As we
Yes.
might, but in the north, we could have 30 acres, right?
Yes, and we have identified that in the...
As part of the way of paying for a park in the regional park up there.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So that's better than the zero.
That is?
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, it might be better than a sharp stick in the eye, but it's a denigration of the quality of life in the city of Peoria. Bill?
John, any idea what the average park size is, a neighborhood park size?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Average park size currently, I could look through this guide right now and give you a specific answer, but we range from very small, 3 to 5 acres, to the 85 acres. So to grab that in between, we're probably knocking 20, 22, but that's a guess off of where we might be on an average community park size or neighborhood park size. Okay?
So the neighborhood parks roughly fall into it's okay for impact fees.
Yes, they do. And as we look through our definitions with the new master plan that we'll have for your review first part of January, with that, we make that recommendation to kind of reclassify what the neighborhood park looks like, its size, its amenity package, and that's all been put into the IIP as well.
Carlo?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yeah, I bring this up every year at the budget. Neighborhood parks. Thank you. Yeah, I bring this up every year on the parks, neighborhood parks, community parks. I know we have one coming to my district. She's shaking her head. I'm glad. I hope it's still there. And where do we stand on that? And that's on 99th and Olive. And what's that, about 19 acres? Is it more than that?
15, 14, something like that? It's, you can answer.
Yeah, it's around 15 to 20.
And where do we stand on that? I mean, is it going to be built someday?
It's in the CIP plan.
Yep.
But not in the IIP plan because of the difference in funding sources. But it is in the plan, and it is further out.
How far out?
Within 10 years.
10 years.
8 to 10?
Last time I heard it was like 4 or 5. They keep on pushing it back. And why are we pushing it back? Is there a reason? Do you have the money? Where does that money come from? Is it impact fees?
This is a great example of how the changes in the impact fee statute work. That park isn't the result of the burden of new growth. So therefore, it isn't a type of park that would be eligible for being included in the infrastructure improvements plan to be funded by impact fees. Now, you certainly can fund it through any other source, but it's the type of, this is exactly how the change. The old law would have given you broad discretion to have included it. The new law says, no, you don't. And that's the best example of how the new law has changed the dynamics of what we include and what we don't.
Right. And I can assure you, Carlo, that the project is in the 10-year capital improvement program, and I believe right now it is funded with GO bonds as the source. We are not anticipating putting it in the impact fee analysis for the reasons that Steve said, is because the growth that's occurring in that area is not generating the need for that park, but we still do know that we want a park in that area, and so it's still in the capital program, just not funded with impact fees.
But you're saying 10 years now.
I don't know the exact date, and it's less than 10 years, but I don't know the exact date off the top of my head.
So next year when we come back, you'll tell me 20 years?
Mr. Leone, let us give you a specific answer to the question. We weren't prepared for that tonight since that's not specifically the agenda here, but let us get you an exact answer.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. The last two fee categories that I'd like to just spend a quick moment talking about is our public safety categories, and that is our fire and our police fees. We talked a little bit about that. These are two fees where we are anticipating doing a citywide service area, and that's pretty much in line with how traditionally these fees are looked at across all cities, and that's primarily because obviously they serve on a citywide basis and serve in all those areas. So in the fire fees, we're looking at new fire stations and vehicles, as we talked before, the vehicles that are associated with that, as well as in the police, we're looking at some northern, providing some facilities in the northern area, where of course a lot of that growth is occurring, as well as the police vehicles that are needed there. In both cases, we are looking at some decreased fees. In fire, that's primarily driven because, again, some of the limitations in our prior impact fee analysis, we were able to include the training facility, the regional training facility. We no longer can do that. So some project costs have been reduced significantly. On the police, there are some fund balances that we have available from impact fees collected that we can apply that are reducing the need in the future for some dollars. So the fees are decreasing in that area.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mayor.
Sorry.
So public safety is being looked at for the entire city?
Yes.
Okay. Would there be a difference between the south and some of the northern part of the city. The south, we're not going to be building any facilities that I'm aware of.
Right, there wouldn't be any facilities needed. However, things like police facilities, typically there are some facility needs, but police serves on a citywide basis, as does fire. They all respond citywide. So generally, we look at those areas as having a citywide service.
Because I understand the police vehicles, fire vehicles, but the police stations are stationary.
I agree, and I understand we have, obviously our administrative building down here that we use. We also have our Pinnacle Peak Public Safety Facility. We're planning a small expansion on that one, and possibly a northern facility from a police standpoint. So I do understand that, but overall we look at that as one whole service area because they're servicing all those facilities help service. It's not to say something in the northern part of the city that's being built in the northern part of the city won't serve or have the ability to serve areas in the southern part of the city as well.
But the reason we have it up north is to serve the north. I understand that
Right.
in theory we do serve the entire city, but public safety building here in the south serves the south and the building up north serves the north.
That's fair to look at it that way. I don't know that we certainly could go back and look at what service areas would look like. It's difficult because in these areas you're talking about response times and trying to be able to serve, and we serve citywide in those areas. We even get service from outside of the city in many of these cases. So what you use as your factor for that, we can look at some options for that, but I would tell you typically this is one that we look at from a citywide service area.
Thank you. Yeah, this just gives us more flexibility. It doesn't mean we're going to build more stations than we need in the south. We're probably going to build stations more so in the north, but this gives us more flexibility, and we can define it as one zone, right? And
Yeah, I don't think
that's
there's
what we're doing.
anything in the statute that says that we couldn't have one service area. Again, we need to show, and where the fees are going to be paid primarily, yes, are in the northern portion of the city, and that is where a lot of the facilities are going to be placed.
Okay, thank you.
And the new growth would pay for that, and it mostly would come from the north, the new growth.
Questions?
Okay. So I won't go through that again, but that kind of brings us back, all three of those things that we talked about, brings us back to basically that output, which will be that we'll also be including in our update, what those fee levels are going to be and what the recommended fee levels are. Oops, that came in a little early. I want to talk just real quickly. Another way to kind of look at it is that we've spent a lot of time over the last year really talking about impact fees with you, but also with our stakeholders. We've had a number of meetings to talk through some policy recommendations, early policy recommendations, as well as provided the draft report for our stakeholders to start reviewing on October 10th. We've met 7 times with our stakeholders since that time. And had some really good, like I said, collaborative discussions. And ultimately, we are planning to have an updated report with all of the changes and recommendations that have come as part of these discussions available on December 6th online for additional review and in preparation of the public hearing that we're required to do. So the first thing you're going to be asked to do is going to be to adopt the growth projections and the capital projects. That's the first piece of this. So we'll have a public hearing on that on January 7th, followed by the council adoption, which can occur no earlier than 30 days after the public hearing. We're going to then come back to you with the public hearing for the fee ordinance, which will be the big ordinance that has all the fees associated, fee levels associated, some implementation discussions, policy discussions on credits and things, and how that's all going to work, as well as that will all be included in the fee ordinance, and then we'll ask you to adopt that in the April timeframe is where we're looking at, and again, can't be adopted. I put these items on here, these no less than 30 days after the public hearing, or no more than 30 days, or no less than 30 days after the public hearing, because I want to explain to you that there is a very specific time process that we have to follow. The statute has some very specific time limitations about how we have to go about getting these fees adopted. So these are some of the major ones that are included. Once you adopt the fee ordinance in April, the new fees would become effective 75 days after, or no earlier than 75 days after you adopt the fee ordinance. So that kind of, we're working backwards from about July 1st, trying to get them in place by July 1st, and what those timeline requirements are in order for us to get these in place in time. And then, yep, the fees must be in place by August 1st, 2014, or in those cases, if we are not able to do that, we will not be able to charge any impact fees in any fee category until such time that we get them in place and make them effective.
That's what I call incentive.
It's incentive.
Mr. Ainsley?
Yeah, we really
Ms.
didn't
Carla.
talk about how we're going to determine fees. Is there anything in the legislation that addresses that, or is it kind of wide
Councilmember Ames,
open?
members of the council, really, it's this process that you're going through that ultimately, the next piece of this, as you go through this process and looking at Andrew's projections, service areas, infrastructure improvement plan, out of all that, as the chart that Katie had up on the screen, is going to come up a set of recommended fees, which the staff will provide and explain how those work from that analysis. And that will be coming to you as part of this process. Really, as you can see right here in this impact fee study update, fee levels is sort of the output of these things that we've discussed tonight. So the answer is yes, those have to come to you, and they will be coming to you, but this is kind of the preliminary to get you to that.
Yeah, the short version is we'll have multiple study sessions about this process as we go along.
Right.
Okay, and I had a question about that. So could you go back to that slide, the one that had the time frames, the last one? Okay, so at the first council meeting in January, we're going to have just a public hearing that will include the growth projections and the capital projects, and that's the first time we're going to see that? It'll be in our council packet?
Actually, we will put a report like this that includes everything related to the growth projections and the capital projects online on this Friday. So
This
that
Friday.
will be when that's available, and we would fully expect that then we will have, and I will be informing all of our stakeholders that it's available. Please spend some time, go through it, ensure that you know what you want to see in there is in there, and that what we discussed is in there, and or not, depending upon whether or not we opted to include those things. But then give me feedback. I mean, we want to hear from you. The public hearing is an opportunity for them to come publicly at a meeting and discuss or provide some comment on the study as to, whether they believe it meets what they believe it should include or doesn't, and then we will come back. And if we need to make changes, we still have that opportunity to make changes to the study before we come and adopt it in February.
Okay, so it'll be online soon, and in January, that'll be just a public hearing saying if there were any changes, we'd like to hear about it. And then in February, those changes, if we choose, will be incorporated
Into a final.
into a final, and that's it. And that's it. In February, we are adopting.
You're adopting the
Growth projections,
Growth projections.
and basically the infrastructure improvement plan.
Right,
You
the
won't be
projects and
adopting the
growth
fees.
So those
until
first
later.
two blocks of that process that ultimately drives impact fees, the first two pieces were growth assumptions in your IIP or capital plan. Those are the items that are subject to the public hearing on January 7th and potentially council action on February 18th. Then, once those are adopted, if I'm following this correctly, the fees themselves, that's the output, will come back to you via a public hearing on March 4th, and then for your final consideration and adoption on April 8th of the actual fees themselves.
I guess my concern is, now that I understand that it's more difficult to make amendments than I thought that it was going to be, that the capital projects, as they relate to impact fees, that things are going to come up. Things are going to come up within this 10-year period of time that are going to drastically change. I mean, look how much change there has been in the last 10 years. I'm concerned about our process for making amendments. That's what it comes down to. I'm concerned about that. So we have just a very short period of time to put it in place, and it seems to me that it's more set in stone than clay.
Councilmember Collins, I understand that. Part of it is simply the statutory framework that creates these timeframes, which drives a big piece of this. The other is the statutory framework for the infrastructure improvements plan and the growth projections. But as you just mentioned, and as Katie and Brent both mentioned earlier, this is something that on an ongoing basis we will have to be looking at. The growth projections are something in the early years are there's a lot more detail supporting that than there would be in the later years. And the statute envisions while it requires you to do it every 5 years, that's simply because there was a fear that some cities would never do it. Realistically, in a city like Peoria, having seen the changes over a long period of time, I foresee that we're certainly going to be doing it much quicker than every 5 years, because there's no way that you can, to meet the requirements of the statute, it's going to drive us to doing that.
Council also has a policy regarding updating impact fees, and it's in your principles of sound financial management. And the policy, I believe, states that council will review impact fees every 2 years. So it could certainly be more often than that if we need to, but your current 2-year policy is certainly shorter than the legislative required 5-year period.
I have some concern. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I still have a question on fee. I realize, the more growth and that's going to be more dollars, but isn't there a rate set for impact fees that we use to multiply by that growth? And I know there are limitations for the size of parks but
no, there isn't a rate set for impact fees like we think of property tax rates or sales tax rates.
We set that?
You will set that.
Is that more competitively we look at that?
Well, you're going to set that based on the mandates in the statute for growth projections and the infrastructure improvement plan. Those 2 items are going to lead to an output, which is going to be your fee. And because the statute very specifically defines both how you do growth projections and how you do the infrastructure improvement plan, those specific definitions are going to directly decide the output, which is going to be your fee.
So it's the number of capital projects we want to do in. Really.
Well, it's a number, but meeting the requirements of the statute.
Within the requirements of the,
yeah.
yes.
And
that's going to determine the rate.
Years, and that their growth connected to the substantial nexus between new growth and that project being needed. All of those things are going to directly determine
I understand.
Right.
Any other questions or comments? I have some concerns about this too. After the public hearing on growth projections and capital projects, I would suggest we work in another study session similar to this one. I would suggest we do another one after we adopt those, and we try to get ahead of the public hearing on fee ordinance. And I would like to have, again, a study session just like this, where we're not limited to 2 hours by time of the council session. And then we'll be ready for the fee ordinance of the public hearing. And if anything comes up out of that gives us heartburn or concern, we can have another study session between the public hearing and the adoption of the fee ordinance itself.
That's a great idea.
These are extremely critical. This is an extremely critical issue for the city of Peoria's future. And I think we need to be very careful and methodical about how we go about this. And I'm going to ask everybody to put in more time. I know that's no fun, but this is too important to rush.
What I would like to say, Mayor, is that when this becomes available on Friday, when these become available on the website, they will include preliminary fee calculations as well as all the method. They will include it. Since it's an output of what we're proposing, it's easy to know what that fee level is or a proposed fee level is. So it's included. It's currently included in the study that we have out there right now. It will also be included. So there will be an opportunity to see what the preliminary fees would be, assuming no changes. If changes are made, they obviously might change the fee slightly. It may not change the fee depending on the change, but that will all be available the end of this week on December 6th as part of the study.
When that goes up on Friday, is it going to give me a fee range?
There's going to be
just a recommended fee?
There's going to be a calculated fee based upon the growth projections and capital projects that we're including. So that will be the calculated fee, which would ultimately be the recommended fee that we would bring forward, and council then could make some decision on fee levels associated with that.
Okay, now would that also be the maximum fee?
That would be the maximum supportable fee based upon this, yes.
And each developer would pay his or her proportion
That's right.
to the growth.
Based on what they're building and.
And Mayor, that's an important point to note. As was alluded to earlier, the council had the flexibility under the old statute to establish percentages of the maximum supported fee, so that you might have the same class of development paying a different fee. That is one of the things that the statute really doesn't allow for. The classifications are now based on all residential has to pay a fee based on service areas. All commercial has to pay a fee based on service areas. That flexibility to say, well, we're going to do in this service area maybe this percentage of maximum supportable, that again is one of those changes in the law that becomes really problematic. That's going to go away.
Okay, so the law took away our flexibility. Last time we did it, we made the fees up north extremely high, or we went to the max or whatever.
Yeah.
And we went to a reduced fee for Central in terms of an attempt to try to drive growth to the middle part of the city, so you get so much hopscotch growth here. And so, but that's been taken away.
That's going to really go away. You're going to, in essence, in some respects, have the same outcome, because based on service areas, if you have no projects, you have no fees. But it's not going to be because you have percentages.
Boy, I sure wish the legislature would stop helping us. Any other questions or comments?
We started off this conversation talking about other sources of revenue, such as CFDs and things like that. When are we going to begin those conversations?
I'm sorry, which conversations, Councilor?
We started off this study session talking about other sources of revenues and different tools, such as CFDs. We've got a very clear-cut policy on a CFD right now.
Correct.
Obviously, if we want to change the discussions that we've had in the past about those other sources of funding mechanisms,
Yes.
we have to talk about changing the existing policies. So we need to start that conversation about funding sources and tools that we have currently for development.
Yes,
So
I think
The short version of the question is, what are we going to do to make up for the shortfall that the new impact fees are going to create?
Right, I understand.
And when are we going to start talking about that, and what's the procedure?
We intend the beginning of that to occur this Friday. As we begin talking about the coming budget discussions this coming Friday in our workshop, those are the kinds of things that we want to get feedback from the council about.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yes, you bet.
Other questions or comments? We're adjourned. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
And I have one follow-up. Councilmember Leone, your project that you mentioned is in 2020. That's 7 years out. We just checked.